Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and you are listening to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, where we bring you the best ingredients so that you can brew your own faith. Today on the podcast is the one and only Merold Westphal. This is a third of 4 guest lectures from the End of Religion Conference, sponsored by Villanova University. Jacob hooked us up. He was like, let's partner, let's do this, and here it is. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you listen, and I hope you share and comment and go click through the homebrewed links and find yourself a Westphal book to read on the beach this summer. But before we jump in to the podcast, I want to tell a group of you just what is up. That's right. Those of you that are saying to yourself, I want to go do something super sweet. And that super sweet thing would be going to Subverting the Norm in Springfield, Illinois, Drury University, November 5th to 7th. If you're going to come, which you should, because Peter Rollins, Jack Caputo, Sarah Moody, and Catherine Keller's going to be there this year. Aaron Carter's going to be there. And, I'm just saying, there's going to be a Homebrewed Christianity podcast. It is going to be of the Zestalicious category. There's going to be even more excitement that you could pack in the 5th to 7th. You know why? Because we're doing a Homebrewed Christianity Theology Nerd Boot Camp the day before, on the 4th of November, is going to get itself filled with nerdy excitement. Why? Jack Caputo and I are doing the boot camp together. It is a one-day nerdy fiesta of all-out philosophical geekery, because the theme of this boot camp for your theology nerd pleasure is When Philosophers Speak of God. We're going to talk about all these different philosophers. What is it? How is it? Who is it that they understand God to be? How does their philosophy capture, understand, expound it? Then what would that mean theologically to appropriate these different philosophical systems, answers, and ideas? That's going to happen. Me and Jack, and we're going to do it like all day long on the 4th, and then afterwards, the final session is where we deal with the Holy Spirits, and that's where you, Jack, me, and the other nerds that come a day early for this spectacular will go have a few beverages, have some dinner together, and take really sweet selfies. Because if you're listening, and the idea of getting a selfie with Jack Caputo in Springfield, Illinois, November 4th at the end of the Theology Nerd Bootcamp was exciting, then you're the one that should come to the bootcamp. So go to homebrewedchristianity.com. There's links over to the Theology Nerd Bootcamp. Sign up. Come, go to Subvert the Norm. And the thing is, I have a discount code. Say what, Trip? Trip, what's the code? Oh, that's a good question, Mr. Man over there. I really want to go, but I want a deal. Well, I have a deal for you. Just type in, when you go get your Subvert the Norm ticket, No, wait. You don't even remember your own code. That's right. It's HBC STN. HBC, Homebrewed Christianity, STN, Subvert the Norm. You just type in HBC STN, boom, you get discount. That's what I'm talking about. The best discount around, because saving money's cool. Anyway, sign up, tell me you're coming, be prepared for a podcast, be prepared for a day with Jack Caputo talking about the GOD philosophically. And, I hope to see all of you there, and my friend over here that has comments about this intro. Oh, that's really great, Trip. I think I'm gonna go. That's good, but you should also go to homebrewedchristianity.com right now. And when you're there, make sure you share the podcast. Make sure you check out some books. Make sure you tweet it up. Make sure you call the speak pipe and leave questions. But the most important thing for you to do while you're there is to go ahead and sign up for the Theology Nerd Bootcamp. Because what's better to do in November? And if that wasn't enough, let me tell you a secret. I'm excited about a secret. Well, let me tell you. At Subvert the Norm, there's going to be a book release that is going to just change everything, at least on my bookshelf. And that is The Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus, Lord, Liar, Lunatic, or Just Freaking Awesome. It happens right there at Subvert the Norm. And if that wasn't enough, there's also going to be another book release party for Mr. Jack Caputo. Yep. And it's going to be about his philosophical, theological autobiography. So it's Hope Against Hope. That book is going to happen there. So, like, not going is just ridiculous. Do yourself a favor. Come to Springfield, Illinois, and hang out with all your favorite nerds. All right, here it comes. Merold Westphal on the podcast. Prepare to enjoy yourself, because it won't be that hard. Afterwards, people ask him some questions. There's one more of these coming up soon. It's Jack Caputo, and then there's some panel on it, and then, hopefully, me and Greg are going to get back together and talk about all these different talks. We're going to talk about the topics. We're going to ask some questions to each other. We're going to have some fun. Yeah, that's right. It'll be fun. All right. Have an excellent, wonderful, spectacular day. And remember. What am I supposed to remember, Trip? Well, remember to share the brew. Oh, I like to share. Sharing is caring. That's a good thing to remember. All right, sharing is caring. Peace.
I haven't said anything yet. There's a rumor going around that they're trying to start up a basketball program here. Can anybody confirm that for me? 2 points. They asked me to sign a waiver on having cameras on this thing, and I did. And I put down my normal 3 caveats. Number 1, I didn't say it. Second, it was taken out of context. Third, I promised never to say it again. They told me I should go into politics. I think any discussion of postmodernism requires one give an account of what modernity one has in mind. And I'm obviously talking about philosophy, not architecture or movies that get labeled postmodern. And the philosophical modernity that I'm thinking of is sometimes referred to as the Enlightenment project, which could be described as the project of moving from mythos to logos, from tradition to critique, and from authority to autonomy. All within the framework of a conception of reason as universal. That is to say, not rendered particular by being relative to any particular presuppositions or horizons. What Aaron was saying yesterday about objectivity is another way of saying the same thing, I think. My thought is objective if it isn't rendered subjective by being relative to some particular presuppositions, assumptions, metaphysical commitments, and so forth. Now, in the philosophy of religion, that project, I think, is best described by stealing the title of Kant's so-called fourth critique, Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. And my view is that the best 17th century version of that project is Spinoza's, and the best 18th century version of that project is Kant's, and the best 19th century version is Hegel's. By best, I mean most powerful. There are lots of people who contributed to that project, but I think none with greater philosophical power than that particular trio. And I want to make several observations about them as, if you like, the holy trinity of modernity, so far as philosophy is concerned. All of them are committed to this notion of reason as universal, and all of them present their philosophies as the voice of universal reason. The problem is that each is deeply incompatible with both of the other two. And one doesn't have to be very far into either of them to discover that, so far as the substance is concerned, that's the case. And so I find myself thinking that what they should have done is use some superscripts or some subscripts and said, I'm appealing to reason sub S, and I'm appealing to reason sub K, and I'm appealing to reason sub H, each of which is, unfortunately, for their project, quite particular. And it seems to me that those three versions of reason are as particular as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Borrowing Will Herberg's title from A Sociology of American Religion in the 50s, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. So the project of escaping from particularity and becoming the voice of universal reason, and dare I say, deconstructs itself without much help from us. And if Jesus were to encounter the reason to which this trio appeals and ask, "What is your name?" I think the answer would have to be, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Now, in relationship to that conception of reason, I want to suggest that postmodernism should be thought of in big tent terms, although I will lapse into talking about the usual suspects. But wherever that concept of reason is seriously challenged, it seems to me we have a philosophical activity that is postmodern. It seeks to expose the mythos of modernity's logos and show it to demythologize it, if you like. So where does one find postmodern philosophy in that big tent sense? Certainly in French post-structuralism, also in philosophical hermeneutics as developed by Gadamer and Ricoeur and McIntyre and Heidegger for that matter. Also in hermeneutical philosophy of science as developed by Kuhn and Feyerabend and Hansen and others. One finds it in American pragmatism, especially John Dewey and C.I. Lewis. And one finds it in analytic philosophy wherever one finds a critique of the strong foundationalism that was part of modernity's project much of the time. And so Rorty offers a critique of privileged representations, and Sellers offers, my teacher, Sellers, offers a critique of the myth of the given, and Reformed epistemology, as developed by Plantinga and Waltersdorf, offers a critique of strong foundationalism that appeals to propositions that are either self-evident or evident to the senses or incorrigible. That's usually applied to 3-year-olds. In this case, it's applied to propositions like, my tooth hurts. And Derrida, I think, would see all of those pseudo-foundations, that is, those that these postmodernisms resist, as appeals to sheer presence. So there are lots of different vocabularies that have been developed. And it seems to me that we do well to be multilingual and recognize when different terms are pointing in more or less the same direction. I don't want to say synonyms in the strictest sense of the term, but they're making, it seems to me, the same point. So Rorty, when he makes the hermeneutical turn in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, devotes a great deal of time to Derrida and Dewey and Heidegger and Gadamer and Kuhn and Nietzsche and Putnam and Quine and Sellers and Wittgenstein. And in my way of thinking, all of them deserve the title postmodern. They all critique that feature of modernity. Nancy Murphy has a nice little book called Anglo-American Postmodernism. And she, with her sort of left hand, alludes to deconstruction and post-structuralism, about which she doesn't know very much. But she's talking about Anglo-American postmodernism, and so she focuses on Feyerabend, under whom she studied, and Kuhn, and Quine, and Sellers, and Wittgenstein. So that's a rough sketch of what I mean by big tent postmodernity. And what I want to say most generally about it is that Christianity can welcome and appropriate the postmodern turn. Now, I say Christianity instead of religion, partly because I'm a Christian, partly because Christianity is the religion that's most involved in the discussions, partly because I don't want to pretend I know what religion is, from yesterday's discussion, partly because while I think that mutatis mutandis, what I have to say has some bearing on the other Abrahamic monotheisms, I don't have any pretense to be speaking here about the Asian religions. And so I'll speak about Christianity from time to time, and by that I mean mere Christianity, borrowing Lewis's phrase, not necessarily his particular presentation of it. Mere Christianity is that Christianity that is expressed, for example, in the ecumenical councils, is shared by the Eastern Orthodox churches, by the Roman Catholic Church, and by the Protestant churches. And there is a great deal that is shared across those traditions in spite of very significant differences among them. Now, insofar as deconstruction is the demythologizing of modernity by taking the hermeneutical turn, and I find that phrase the most helpful overall description. The hermeneutical turn is what distinguishes modernity from postmodernity, or distinguishes postmodernity from modernity. The awareness of the situatedness of human thinking in some particular horizon, in some language game, in some paradigm, in some set of presuppositions, even if you want to think with Spinoza, a certain set of axioms or thoughts that function as axioms for certain thinkers. The recognizing of that particularity, which suggests that the notion of some neutral standpoint at which one could stand to adjudge among rival thoughts is itself illusory, and that the reasons one gives in support of one's own preferences tend to be internal to that system, although sometimes they're shared by other systems, what Rawls calls overlapping consensus. That's a reality too. But if you take the hermeneutical turn, you don't assume that the overlapping consensus is some sort of universally shared point of view. So I say Christianity can welcome and incorporate the fundamental move of postmodern philosophy, partly because it's a theory about the finitude of human knowledge, and that from a theological point of view, in a Christian context, expresses the doctrine of creation. God is the creator and we are not, and in a whole variety of ways, because of that, we are finite and not infinite. At the same time, the hermeneutics of suspicion has played a significant role in postmodern philosophy, and the hermeneutics of suspicion corresponds to the theological notion of sinfulness, in which our desires, including especially those desires that we don't wish to acknowledge to ourselves, and that we manage to hide from ourselves in what Sartre calls bad faith, play a significant role in shaping our beliefs and our practices. We believe and do what we would like to do for motives that we do our best to keep hidden from ourselves. My translation of Sartre's notion of bad faith is managing not to notice. And I think that captures his sense that we really do know, in some important sense, what's going on. But we manage not to know at the same time. That's conceptually, that sounds like a real trick. But I think each of us knows from our own experience that it's much easier to do than it is to explain. Thirdly, there is a theme in the hermeneutical turn which we are particularized in relation to others who are not making our assumptions, who are not part of our language game, and so forth. And it's what I call inverted intentionality. This is the Levinasian moment. And this can be made to correspond to the notion of existence coram Deo, before the face of God. Insofar as Derrida formulates this theme in a different context, non-theistic context, my gaze is no longer the measure of things. And the way I like to put it is that in being seen and in being addressed, when the intentional arrows are coming at me from some other, instead of my being the source of the intentional arrows that confer meaning, Zingebung, meaning is defined for me sometimes as an assault, sometimes as a gift. One can think of Abraham, for example, who was given a name and a mission that he had not planned for himself and didn't always welcome. I would rather think, for the moment, of Mary. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For he has looked with favor on his lowly servant. Now, our minds almost immediately go to favor. And that's appropriate. But I want to direct our minds right now to, he has looked upon me. Mary was given a new identity, a new mission in life, one she didn't choose, probably one she didn't even hope for, one that scared her. I was about to say scared the hell out of her. Maybe it did. Maybe that's why she was so holy. But she didn't set the agenda for her life. It was given to her. And it took some doing to recognize that this was a gift. But even before that comes, she had already responded in the way that Christian faith says we ought to respond to, being de-centered in this way. Here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word. Of course, she says that to the angel Gabriel, but she understood that he was speaking on behalf of God when she said that. So my suggestion is that Mary has been reading Levinas, and that when we read Levinas, we can think back to a whole variety of biblical contexts and motifs which are illuminated by the way in which he develops the notion of inverted intentionality in the face. And for that matter, when we read Sartre's analysis of the look, I take Sartre to be the greatest theologian of original sin since Augustine. He doesn't call it sin, but his analysis of our desperate attempt to objectify the look that comes to us and be the one who's doing the looking rather than the one who is looked at, is a very powerful analysis of something we can all recognize easily in others, and also in ourselves if we are willing to take a long, hard look. And he has a way of formulating the theological implications of that. He says, man is the desire to be God. And women too. Jack Caputo has been reading Levinas too, and he articulates in a way I find helpful the triumph of heteronomy over Enlightenment autonomy that's involved in inverted intentionality in a Levinasian overtone. He writes, obligation, on the other hand, is ugly, Jewish, Abrahamic. It is the ugliness of discord and subjection, of being disrupted and disturbed by a call that comes from without. This dispossession and alienation will not do at all in ethics, the ethics he's against, the theory that ethics comes from my intentionality, if you like, which is philosophy. In philosophy, obligation must always be, in one way or another, something I do myself. Just as in philosophy, truth is something I have or am myself. In another place he writes, obligation is not a rational utterance, a logos, received on the other end as wholly intelligible, and hence as worthy of being obeyed. That would make it mine, me, a case of autonomy and auto-dictation. There is also a linguistic as well as a Levinasian critique of autonomy to be found in Derrida. That is to say, I had articulated inverse intentionality in terms of being seen and being addressed. And this isn't quite either of those. But this is how Derrida puts it. Whenever we speak, quote, it is already too late. Language has started without us and in us before us. There would be no responsibility without this prior coming of the trace, or if autonomy were first or absolute. Autonomy itself would not be possible. End of quotation. In other words, any autonomy is particular and is relative to what other heteronomy defines the hermeneutical circle in which we operate. Or when he says language has already begun without us, we are born into a language game, or more precisely, an intersecting network of language games. And our thinking is ours, but it's always in some way dependent upon what we have inherited and by which we are conditioned, so that we are never at the starting point. And whatever is uniquely ours is never fully uniquely ours, but always depending on something we have borrowed or inherited. And one can, I think, happily use the notion of language games here and not just language, because it isn't just speaking that's involved, it's the forms of life which are shaped by and give substance to different modes of speaking. The practices support the speaking, and the speaking supports the practices, and so forth. Now, this way of thinking, this triple heteronomy of created finitude and fallen guiltiness and inverse intentionality, decenteredness, can be welcomed and appropriated by mere Christianity, precisely because the Christian narrative is a narrative about a triple heteronomy: creation and the fall and redemption. In each case, God is first and we come along afterwards. God is the center and we are the periphery. And so we can read the various kinds of postmodern philosophy that articulate one or more of these modes of non-universal reason as being friendly to mere Christianity. Now, this is not just an epistemological critique, although it is certainly that, but it has existential import as well. Here I'm quoting Stephanos Geroulanos. He says, once the horizon of existence and thought, the human being became a self-doubting mystery lacking all existence or epistemic certainty other than its own death. Humanism appeared to many philosophers and writers as an indefensible foundation of modernity that needed to be overcome. The very process of thinking and defining the human imploded the conceptual foundation of modern thought into an unstable category, even an aporia. That epistemological theme of repudiating objectivism and universal reason is in effect a way of re-understanding what it is to be a human being, and a challenge to the humanism that defines human being in terms of an exaggerated conception of what reason might be. And here I'm reminded of the opening paragraphs of Calvin's Institutes, where Calvin insists that our knowledge of ourselves is always dependent upon and derivative from our knowledge of God. And if it isn't in that way derived, it's likely to be misleading and corrupted. Now, I want to speak more particularly about a couple of the usual suspects, as I promised. Heidegger and Derrida. I want to call attention to the fact that neither of them has abandoned the project of religion within the limits of reason alone. And each of them carries on that project in his own way. In the case of Heidegger, I'm thinking of his essay, Phenomenology and Theology, which is contemporary with Being in Time, in which he tells us that it's the task of philosophy, namely Heideggerian phenomenology. Most of us, when we say philosophy, mean my philosophy. It's the task of philosophy to correct theology. Jeff talked yesterday about what he takes to be an unhappy division between philosophy and theology in Heidegger, but what I'm finding problematic is not so much the distinction between them as the relationship that is postulated between them. The distinction between them has a long and I think fairly respectable heritage. It came to be in a usage that never had any formal ratification, that philosophy signified thinking about things, including matters religious, without appeal to revelation as having any biblical revelation and the teachings and traditions of the church as having any normative significance, unaided human reason. Whereas theology was understood to be an attempt to think about these things on the assumption that there was some specifically religious norm, whether that was Scripture or Scripture and tradition, or Scripture and tradition as prescribed by the church or whatever. So when he distinguishes, as we'll see, he's working with that distinction, which he inherits. And it's the task of philosophy to correct. I counted once in the English translation 9 separate times in which he says it's the task of philosophy to correct theology. He says that the inconceivable, his words, subject of theology, quote now, is indeed to be, if it is to indeed to disclose properly. In other words, if this doesn't happen, it's not proper discourse. It can only be by way of an appropriate conceptual interpretation. Without this appropriate conceptual interpretation, the discourse is inappropriate. And he'll tell us that this happens when the ontic concepts of theology are corrected by phenomenology and thus, quote, ontologically determined by a content that is pre-Christian and that can be grasped purely rationally. Now, I'm sure by pre-Christian he didn't mean Babylonian and Greek and Roman and so forth. What he means by pre-Christian is purely rationally, that is to say, by human reason without any appeal to specifically religious norms, and in particular Christian norms. Now this seems to me simply a continuation of the project of Spinoza and Kant and Hegel and many others, with a different conception of reason. Although when he talks about purely rationally and pre-Christian, he seems to be, I don't know if this really happens or not, but it makes me wonder whether he applies his own theory of the hermeneutical character of understanding to being in time itself as one particular perspective. Here's a set of concepts that one could use in theology, but why use these rather than some other? Well, these are purely rational conceptions. And that sounds a whole lot more modern to me than it does postmodern. That, it seems to me, a mere Christian should resist. That any philosophical system should have a normative authority over theological discourse. This is not to say that theological discourse should be immune to critique from friendly sources and from unfriendly sources, but to set things up so that one particular philosophical vocabulary or system of thought is the last word, is the norm by which theological discourse is supposed to be corrected. And that strikes me as far too modern for somebody who wants to keep his postmodern Union card. Derrida explicitly appeals to the project of religion within the limits of reason alone, in faith and knowledge, and tells us that, in a sense, he's going to be working out that project in his own way. And we know in advance that he's not going to be appealing to a universal reason in the way in which Spinoza, Kant, and Hegel do. And he offers a series of corrections, although I don't know any place where he specifically says that it's the task of philosophy to correct theology. But he does offer corrections, and the first correction is negative. And I'm quoting here from the Gift of Death, not from Religion and Knowledge, from Faith and Knowledge. But we should stop thinking about God as someone over there, way up there, transcendent, and what is more capable, more than any satellite orbiting in space, of seeing into the most secret of the most interior places. That concept of God, he says, is an idolatrous stereotype. The second correction, corrections plural, I guess I should say, is positive. It's the replacement of that God with another God, or with perhaps more than one other God. Not quite clear whether these are supposed to be two definitions of the same God, or whether he has a postmodern polytheism at work. God, he says, and I'm quoting here, is the name of the possibility I have of keeping a secret that is visible from the interior but not from the exterior. He told us in the previous one that we should not be thinking about God as a transcendent being. So what should we mean by the term God? It's the name of this possibility I have of keeping secrets. Or God is the name, quote, of the absolute singularity of the other. Every other is wholly other. Or God means that language has started without us and before us. When he gives that line in the passage I quoted earlier, he says, and this is what theologians call God. Well, he's quite wrong about that. This is not what theologians call God. This is what Derrida calls God. When a theologian says God, Derrida says, okay, I mean by that, language has started without us. So, 3 comments. These persuasive redefinitions of God differ so dramatically from what the Abrahamic monotheisms have meant by God for millennia, that they do not even rise to the level of heresy within those traditions. we should recognize them for what they are. Dramatic alternatives to those traditions and all-out assaults on those traditions. Secondly, I commend Derrida for the candor of his atheism and note its affinity with Feuerbach. For what God signifies is always something human, not a transcendent being, but human interiority or interhuman alterity. Thirdly, what Christians should repudiate about Derrida is his atheism and not his deconstruction. The latter is, as I understand it, the latter is a theory of language and a method of reading that have no logical or conceptual links that I can detect with the atheism. The two sit side by side in Derrida. There's a spatial contiguity, even if there's no logical or conceptual linkage. But they could equally well sit by side with a robust Christian theism in which God is a personal being, an agent and not merely a cause, a performer of speech acts, most specifically commands and promises. We were threatened last night with the task of defining God later on this afternoon. I just did. When I use the word God, what I'm thinking about is a personal being who is an agent and not merely a cause, and who is a performer of speech acts, most specifically commands and promises. Whether there are some omnis that should be attached to this personal being is a question I think is a perfectly legitimate question to ask. But the heart of the matter, as I understand theism, is these features that I've mentioned, and not the abstract metaphysical concepts, some of which may very well be appropriate, and some of which maybe are not. So, how has postmodernism affected religion? If that means the religion out there among ordinary people that's surveyed by Gallup polls from time to time and so forth, I really don't know. I'm not in a position to have a very good knowledge of that. I can tell you that when I talk about the hermeneutical turn in the context of religious communities, which I sometimes suspect will be resistant, I'm often, not always, but I'm often surprised to find them more open than I expected to the kinds of insights that I've been talking about as the hermeneutical turn or the postmodern turn. And so maybe there's been some diffusion, some trickle down. I mean, two terms have entered into the ordinary vocabulary, paradigm shift and deconstruction. When people use the term paradigm shift, I always get the sense that they have an idea what that means. And whenever they use the term, I'm talking about non-academics now, when they use the term deconstruction, I always have the sense that they don't have a clue what that means. But that it means somehow unraveling, but nothing more specific or concrete than that. Within the academic context, postmodernism has provided an opportunity for some to pursue the not especially humble project of religion within the limits of reason alone, that is the project of correcting Christianity, with a humbler conception of reason than modernity had when it undertook that project. And it has provided for mere Christians some new ways of expressing basic insights and long-standing commitments about our finitude, our fallenness, in our decentered, heteronymous location before the God of the Bible. Ontotheology was mentioned yesterday, and I want to conclude by saying what I understand by ontotheology and what I think about it, about Heidegger's critique of it. It isn't as much the case now as it used to be, but there was a while when a lot of people bandied that term about very loosely, without giving it any precise meaning, but it functions sort of to discredit any form of theism of the sort that I have in mind when I talk about the Abrahamic monotheisms. All you had to do is say ontotheology in a sufficiently solemn tone of voice, and you had cleared the deck of that. Now we can go on and talk about what's left. Heidegger was much more specific than that. And of course, in the world of Alice in Wonderland, anybody's free to make any term mean whatever they want to, and anybody can mean by ontotheology whatever they want to, but they shouldn't pretend that they're talking about Heidegger's critique of ontotheology unless they stick a little closer than that. So, for Heidegger, what's the what of ontotheology? That God is the highest being who is the key to the meaning of the whole of being, and to think in these terms is to engage in the forgetfulness of being, which is not a being, even the highest being. Of course, that leaves open space for lots of candidates to come and plug in as the highest being. Doesn't need to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, although that's obviously one possible candidate. The why of ontotheology. To render the whole of being intelligible to human understanding. To convert mystery into transparency. And this is why, for me, Spinoza and Hegel are particularly good examples of the kind of thing that Heidegger has in mind. And Aquinas is not. Because for Aquinas, mystery is not dissolved in transparency, but remains, even before that famous mystical term, which may have occurred towards the end of his life. To the how of ontotheology. By means of the principle of sufficient reason, and by means of abstract and personal metaphysical concepts, such as causa prima, ultima ratio, and causa sui. The rule by which ontotheology progresses, quote, the deity can come into philosophy only insofar as philosophy of its own accord and by its own nature requires and determines that and how the deity enters into it. Heidegger himself, it seems to me, is a prize example of ontotheology in that respect, insofar as he says that God can enter into our discourse only insofar as it's been corrected by his philosophical discourse. Philosophy sets the rules that God must conform to in order to be appropriately expressed. And finally, the result, again, a very familiar quotation, man can neither pray nor sacrifice before the causa sui, cannot fall to his knees in awe or play music or dance before this God. It seems to me that the project of rendering everything intelligible, the primacy of abstract impersonal metaphysical concepts, the notion that deity should have a normative authority over our God talk and our theological discourse and practices, all of those represent an ontological possibility that Christian thinkers should resist. Precisely for the reason Heidegger gives. You deprive that God of any serious religious significance when you do that. So my suggestion is that for Christian theology, ontotheology in the Heideggerian sense is never the appropriate essence of the or rule of the game. But it's always a temptation in some form. Every theological system is subject to the temptation of thinking we've got God in our categories and we now understand it. It's no longer mysterious. And we can operate as if our system of thinking and the practices which they ratify are the answer to the questions we have. And at that point, theology has rejoined again the modern project of religion within the limits of reason alone, although this is a reason that's been formed by revelation while forgetting the significance of revelation as a decentering of our thinking and a relativizing of our thinking. And that's why I'm fond, and this is my final comment, I'm fond of the distinction that Karl Barth makes between revelation and religion. Revelation is something that God does for the monotheistic religions. Religion is our reception of it, our interpretation of it, and that's always human, all too human. It's always, if it's serious, the attempt to hear God, not to hear ourselves. But by virtue of our finitude, by virtue of our fallenness, by virtue of our decenteredness, we are never in the position of having finally accomplished that task of being immediately present to the voice of God. We are always somewhat absent, somewhat inattentive, somewhat incomprehending of the voice of God. And postmodernism is a good reminder of that. Thank you.
Before I take a question, I want to ask you for a clarification, Dr. Westphal. For people like me who aren't as familiar with Heidegger as we ought to be, I guess, the importance of the forgetfulness of being the second half of that sort of what is the what. Could you talk on that for a second?
I don't think even Heidegger knew what he meant by that. But Heidegger distinguishes being from beings, things, persons, individuals, whatever. Being is, in a sense, what they do, they are. Better to have been a wasser than never to have ised. And he thinks that Western philosophy hasn't thought the act of being seriously enough because it's been so preoccupied with beings and not sufficiently attentive to the being of beings. And I have always found that distinction to be not the most interesting philosophical problem to worry about, partly because I don't fully understand what it signifies, but that's the language he uses for making the distinction.
Thank you. Questions?
Thanks for a great talk. You mentioned heteronomy kind of towards the beginning, and it seemed to be, maybe I got this wrong, but it seemed to be in the context of, well, we're not autonomous because we're not God, right? So in some sense. Is that true?
That's one of the forms that heteronomy can take, but we are heteronomous in relationship to language, which is there before us,
right,
and to which we are relative because we're shaped by it before we shape it. I mean, even a great creative linguist like, say, Shakespeare, inherits a language. He doesn't create it. He creates some new moves within it, but the game he inherits. And in the Levinasian context, we are heteronymous in relationship to other human beings by whom we are addressed. That's what Derrida is talking about when he says every other is wholly other. You are other to me, and you make claims on me simply by your presence to me. That I am not the author of, and I'm not the final arbiter of, and so forth. So there are lots of different ways in which we're heteronymous, some of which are overtly theistic, but one doesn't have to be a theist to argue for a priority of heteronomy over autonomy.
Yeah, I just wanted to float something out to you that maybe you think is interesting, maybe not, but something that Thomas does in the preface of the Summa, he says, of course, God in His simplicity is perfectly one, because He's pure act, right? No composition, no change, that kind of stuff. But also He said God is in some sense a multitude, right? Because He is the relations of persons, right? And He says that. He says there's a multitude that's not numerical in nature. He calls it a transcendental multitude that's properly predicated of God. I wonder if we could say that God in Himself is both one and many. That seems to be true for Thomas. And I wonder if especially the heteronomy that you mentioned of Levinas right there, we're not necessarily heteronymous just because we're creatures, but rather we're heteronymous as participations in a God who is Himself perfectly heteronymous, right? I just wonder what you think about that.
I'm with you up until that very last phrase. Certainly, all mere Christians want to say that God is one and three. And trying to spell that out usually doesn't do much more than articulate the fact that this is a mystery that we cannot render fully transparent to ourselves. But the fact that there is a Trinitarian diversity, however you spell that out within God, doesn't make God heteronymous. Heteros means something other than myself, from which I derive the law, the nomos. There's a law that comes to me from outside. That's the Caputo quote that I was reading earlier, that has a Levinasian overtone to it. And for mere Christianity and for any Abrahamic monotheism, I believe, there isn't anything other than God to which God is relative, except insofar as God has chosen through creation to become relative to those to whom He gives the gift of life.
I would love to hear your thoughts on Dr. Robbins' thoughts on ontotheology from last night, particularly the statement, God is not dead, God is plastic.
There's one sense in which that's trivially true. That is to say, our thoughts about God are constantly changing. They don't stop in the 4th century or the 6th century or the 12th century or the 20th century. Like reading any classic text, there's no end to new commentaries that suggest new ways of seeing very familiar texts and so forth. And God is like a text, like a classic text in that way. Paul talks about the inexhaustible riches of God's grace. And so God is always changing as we understand, because our understanding is always changing as we move through history and our own personal lives and so forth. Now, whether God's self is a being who changes, that's another question. And the first thing I would want to ask Jeff is whether God is a being for him. I don't know. If you take the death of God in one very familiar sense, God isn't a transcendent being. God is maybe some way of talking about some important dimension of human experience. And if God is a name for some dimension of human life, then yes, God is plastic, because God changes. So one could take, and I don't know that this is the right way, Jeff will have to tell us, one could assume that when someone says God is plastic, God means, that person means by God, something which we're very familiar with and which is constantly changing, namely the world of human life and experience. Whether God as a transparent being changes, that's another question. Aaron talked about open theism. And there are some people who want to be theists in the sense that I have defined, a personal transcendent being, for whom the static conception of a God in eternity who doesn't change seems a little bit too Greek and not enough biblical. And so Nick Walterstorff has a wonderful paper called God Everlasting, in which he argues that Christians shouldn't think of God. And now he means God in my sense as a personal being, precisely of the sort I mentioned. We shouldn't think of God as eternal, but as everlasting. As God as, in some sense, temporal, that's not identical with our temporality, but which has some way of moving along with the world of creation and the world of covenant and so forth, so that there is change in God. I suppose Nick probably would have been excommunicated from the church in Geneva if he'd said that a few centuries earlier. But he waited till the right century to say that.
He had tenure.
He had tenure, yes. So just what Jeff means by God is classic, it could mean several different things. And I don't know. I won't try to speak for Jeff.